So the next speaker is Mark Yeandle, Senior Consultant of ZEN Group of London, who will talk about evaluating OFCs, which are best and why.
Can you hear me? That sounds better. Yeah, good. Okay. I'll start again. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's a delight to be here. Thank you very much to David and the rest of the organisers of OffshoreAlert for organising such a great conference and such a great venue. I've never been to Miami before. I flew in on Saturday night and I thought it was a great place. A quick plea to all the journalists here, please do mention this conference, because otherwise everybody back in the office will give me stick for being on holiday this week. I need some real proof that it happened. We have a great venue outside, we have a great venue inside. I really like the idea of the lights coming down at the end. It's like leaving a pub at the end, so please use that facility to shut me up in a few minutes, if you will. If you see a lot of people going to sleep over the next 40 minutes or so, similarly help them by turning it down. I'll get the picture, okay? Why am I here? Well, I work for a company called ZEN. We do a lot of research in financial services. Clients include banks, asset managers, pension funds, but we also do a lot of market research and research into financial centres themselves. And one of my jobs, apart from putting the Global Financial Centres Index together, is to help individual jurisdictions improve their competitiveness as financial centres. And I'm working for quite a number of clients. One of the more interesting challenges at the moment is working for the Moscow government, but I can talk about that offline rather than this morning. There we go. This is a slide about ZEN. It's a bit of a sales pitch, so I'll skim over it very, very quickly. But we are a think tank, and we have been researching financial centres for many years. The GFCI, Global Financial Centres Index, it's a bit of a mouthful, so we shorten it to GFCI, which is still a bit of a mouthful, but at least it's shorter. You should be receiving on your desks or in front of you, if not, then certainly outside at the end you can get another copy, a copy of the Global Financial Centres Index number 13, which was published about 5-6 weeks ago. I published it in, or I launched it in Canada, and there's a good reason for that, which I'll speak about in a minute, but welcome to all the Canadians who are here today. We've been publishing this every 6 months for 13 issues now, from back in 2007, and it's been a very interesting time for the development of financial centres, as you can imagine. It's become well accepted throughout the world as a genuinely global piece of research. At the moment we cover, or we actually list 77 centres in the index, although we've got another seven or eight that we're investigating, and we haven't quite yet got the data to include in the index, but they'll be within the index in another year. And we're always looking for new centres to add to the list. We're also very lucky in that we get plenty of coverage. Now, I know some of you representatives, some of these organisations are here in the room, so hello to you. But we are lucky enough to get quite a lot of research into this, a lot of coverage into this research, which obviously helps us, but it also encourages people to read the research and also participate. And we are dependent upon our participants who rate or give us their assessments of the financial centres with which they're familiar. I don't want to talk too long about the methodology. There are several pages about it in the report, and there's even more detail on our website if you want to have a look at the detailed methodology. But in summary, we take two sources of information. We speak Are we back on air? Can you hear me? Great, good. Okay, sorry about the... Well, that was actually a planned break, because it helps hand the reports around, so thank you for that. Back to where we were. We speak to a lot of people, and we have an online survey for GFCI 13, this current document. 2,300 odd people from around the world, global financial professionals, gave us their assessments of the financial centres with which they're familiar. And we, on the other side of the equation, we take currently 96, but a whole collection of published data from a whole range of organisations, which is more the sort of qualitative side. We put the whole lot into a big statistical engine with about 6-point-something million data points, and come out with an index. That's a nice, simple way of putting it. It can be quite a complex sort of mathematical thing. I'm sure I had, back in 2007, more hair than I have now, but that's the nature of computers for you. The respondents, well, there's a pretty good mix. Of the 1,500 respondents who actually participated in the last 1 year, we have 2 years' worth of data in the whole set. You've got, well, broadly a third from Europe, quite a number from the offshore centres, about a fifth, similarly from Asia Pacific. A spread of size of organisations they represent, and not a bad spread also of the industry sectors that they come from. Now, I talk about the instrumental factors. These are, as I say, we use 96, and they are all listed in the report. But the ones that most closely correlate to our listing of financial centres tend to be the sort of general factors of competitiveness. So you've got the Global Power City Index. You've got several which actually mention competitiveness in their title. And then you've got a whole range of others, but we'll go through those in a bit more detail. But generally, it's the very broad-ranging measures of competitiveness that tend to correlate very closely with our findings and our rankings. And I think there's no great surprise to me that, in a general sense, the most successful cities in the world tend to be also the most successful global financial centres, because successful people like living in successful places. Over the years, as I say, we use 96 different factors of competitiveness. We tend to group these into 5 sort of overarching themes, if you like. People factors, which include not just the availability of people, but human development, education, quality of life, the availability and flexibility of the labour markets. We have the business environment, which includes everything from tax levels to regulatory levels, to quality of regulation. Market access, which is a measure of the clustering effect in a centre, the numbers of suppliers, the number of clients, and the strength of the financial centre itself. Infrastructure, clearly you've got the built infrastructure, you've got travel infrastructure, you've got ICT infrastructure, and anything that makes we tend to take that for granted when, you know, in London it's a pretty major disaster if electricity goes down. In other parts of the world, power outages and things like that can have a genuine impact on business. And general competitiveness, that's not quite a bucket for everything else that we couldn't fit into one of the other four, but it does try and measure the overall success and the brand appeal and the reputation that a city or a centre enjoys. Now, I'm not going to obviously go through those, they're all listed in the report, but some of the information that we collect on people, you've got some measures of education at the top there. You've got graduates, tertiary education ratios from the World Bank, visa restrictions, Human Development Index by the UN, Citizens' Purchasing Power, Quality of Living Survey by Mercer, HR, the Happy Planet Index, personal safety, top tourist destinations. We even have measures of average days of precipitation. We chose that rather than sunshine on the basis that in certain places it can actually cause havoc to your general business. But of course most of the offshore centres, in the Caribbean at least, do very well in this factor. The people such as Jersey, Guernsey and the Isle of Man do rather less well. Business environment, you've got the general business environment by the Economist Intelligence Unit, ease of doing business, we have corruption perceptions, opacity index, personal tax rates, tax receipts, political risk indicators, and quite a number. Infrastructure, again, office occupancy costs, telecommunication infrastructure, roadways, railways, air connectivity, physical capital, energy sustainability, etc., etc. You get the picture of the type of measures that we collect. Market access, a lot of trading data, and sort of numbers on how active the financial centre is. And then general competitiveness, and we've got business confidence, we've got measures of GDP, and so on and so on. I don't want to bore you too much with all of those. That's the GFCI World. We've got 77 centres with another 5 or 6 that should be added shortly. Pretty big dispersion, as you can see. Now, where's the pointer? That's one of the key areas for us, Asia, and that's where a lot of the growth is coming. All round here, of course, is where we're interested in, and North America generally featuring very strongly, and of course, for us, the European Union and the Eastern Europe is obviously a big centre for us, and of course Latin America is becoming stronger and stronger. Out of our ratings, we'll come on to the offshore centres in a minute, but I kind of see my role and that of Simon as sort of setting the scene for the next day and a half and just give you sort of context of where the offshore centres fit into the overall picture. So the overall picture, you've got, oops, sorry, I meant to do that. London, New York, Hong Kong and Singapore, and from a global perspective I would argue that they're my big four. 2 of them happen to be the same as Simon's big four, but that from a global perspective, London and New York tend to fit into that, or you would assume that they rank. And right back to the start of 2007, certainly the top 3 have been in close contention. If you look at the scores, there's very little between them. On a scale of 1,000, a few points is really pretty insignificant. It's interesting to me that Zurich and Geneva, both in the top 10. You've also got quite a strong representation of Asia. You've obviously got Hong Kong, Singapore, but then you've got Tokyo, Seoul, continue to do remarkably well, and so on and so forth. One thing I would mention when we talk about Canada, you've got 4 centres from Canada, all in the top 20, Toronto, Vancouver, Montreal and Calgary. They're all in the top 20, and Canada's reputation has grown immensely over the last few years. During the financial crisis, Canada didn't have any bank crashes. It didn't have to bail out companies. Some people would think of it in some ways, and their regulatory environment, everything is a little bit dull and even a little bit boring. But right now, a lot of centres like London and New York would really like a bit of boring, I think. There's been, so much activity there, and that's reflected a little bit in the fact that we've got Mark Carney coming over to look after the Bank of England shortly. So another Canadian innovation, I guess, and we'll see how he gets on trying to sort out London. As well as listing all the financial centres, we try and profile them into different groups, because to come up with a list of 77, one of the sort of failings of that is that you're really trying to compare apples with oranges. You can't compare via, London or New York with the Cayman Islands or BVI. It's a completely different type of financial centre. It's in different economic condition. In London and New York have a sort of big economic hinterland and the rest of the country to make business with. A lot of centres don't. They just have their own centre itself. So what we try and do is actually break these centres down into different groups. We use connectivity as one measure, how well connected they are with the rest of the world and other major financial centres, how diverse they are in terms of the offering in financial services, whether they're just strong in one particular area or whether they're equally well represented in banking, asset management, wealth management, insurance, etc., etc. And we use the sort of level of speciality and how deep they are, each industry sector is, or one particular industry sector is. And that enables us to, by compressing those three elements onto two axes, to come up with what we call the global centres, which are differentiated by the fact that they are very well connected with other centres. These are all done purely by mathematical measures. It's not my opinion at all. It's the mathematical measures that come out of our model. And it suggests how many people have rated these centres, which indicates that they're familiar with them, and the people who are based in these centres, how many centres they assess themselves, so sort of outbound assessments, if you like. On the left-hand side, the real global leaders who are both broad and deep in their offering. They have a big diversity, but they're actually fairly well developed in most of those areas. And you've got the sort of names that you'd probably expect. You've certainly got Hong Kong, London, New York, Singapore. Zurich makes that measure. And then in relatively deep, you've got the other Swiss centre, Geneva, who are very strong in asset management and private wealth management, but less so in investment banking, for example. Dublin, slightly surprising up there, but they are extremely well connected with the rest of the world, and they have been far more successful in the index than they are now. I think part of the reason they set themselves up as a sort of, based on their cost levels, as a sort of back office location. Lots of people moved there, and of course the laws of supply and demand have pushed all the costs up, and so Dublin has been, along with a few sort of reputational problems with their banks and things in the last 2 or 3 years, have been suffering. These are the transnational centres. They're less well connected to other centres than the global leaders, but nonetheless they're far more than just local centres. They do deal with quite a lot of international business. And you can see quite a strong, wrong button again, representation of the offshore centres. There is always, especially when you're dealing with so many financial centres, there is a problem with how you actually categorise an offshore centre. I'm a fairly simple soul, and I'm afraid, to use the things that are sort of geographically offshore, because otherwise you get into many taxonomic arguments as to, is Hong Kong an offshore centre to mainland China? Is London an offshore centre to the rest of Europe? is Monaco offshore. It's actually attached to a major continent. Luxembourg geographically is certainly not offshore. So I tend to stick to the genuinely geographically offshore centres, but I will refer to other centres as we go through. And if anybody's got a suggestion on how to really definitively define these centres, then I'd be very interested to hear about it. Local centres, you've got some other centres here that aren't quite as well connected with the outside world by our measures, which is the number of people who assess them. You've got Bahamas, Cyprus, Hamilton, Bermuda, and Mauritius there. The main findings of GFCI 13, before we focus more on the offshore centres themselves, generally the confidence of our respondents has increased quite markedly in the last 6 months. They're feeling more confident about business levels generally than they were in 2011, 2010, 2009. So there is a small return of confidence. Having said that, the volatility of some of the assessments does kind of indicate that some people are still very depressed and some people are sort of, they're bored of being depressed and they want to be happy now. So there is quite a large volatility in the measures of the confidence that people feel. Another finding that we're seeing at the moment, fairly long-term one, but Hong Kong, Singapore are gaining on London and New York. Most centres are gaining on London and New York. London and New York were clearly the leaders 3, 4, 5 years ago, and there's about a 100-point difference between them and Singapore. Now they're all within a shade, and I see that overall trend, frankly, continuing. Other centres around the world are becoming more important. I don't necessarily think it means a demise of London and New York, but I do think that the competition, especially from Asia, will continue to intensify. Europe, well, we've seen a gain for the leading, that's London on top in the red line, which we've seen blip slightly in the last 6 months. The other centres, the leading centres, Frankfurt and Zurich, they're all heading up, and generally, Frankfurt's re-entered the top 10. Generally, a lot of the centres in Europe are doing quite well, but the ones that are specifically in the still in the heat of the euro crisis are suffering. I mean, if we look at the Athens, Madrid, Lisbon, Milan, those sort of centres within the countries that are most affected at the moment, you'll see that they're still in the doldrums. I haven't plotted them because it looks rather depressing. Asia, well, the gradual climb restarts. It stalled a little bit last time we analysed them, but I mean, if you look there, you've got they've all sort of grown slowly and gradually over time. Some have grown remarkably. That yellow line at the bottom is Seoul, and that was what, almost 300 points below Hong Kong 5, 6 years ago, whereas now it's within a pretty small margin. We've seen a huge growth in Seoul. I can talk a long time about Seoul because I work for the Seoul Metropolitan Government on a number of research projects, and it's fascinating to see what they are doing and the reasons that they have become more successful. Some of it's down to their reputation and reputation management. Some of it is down to just purely the Korean sort of work ethic and determination to get things done. And some of it is recognising a few of the failings that they had in Seoul, which I was able to identify and point out. And they have really made an effort to work on that, but that's less directly relevant for you guys right now, but nonetheless it's a very interesting story of how one particular financial centre has done very, very well in the last 6 years. Gains in Latin America, you look down there and you've got the two largest growths coming out of Sao Paulo and Buenos Aires. Rio is also doing well, although it's not plotted there, but it's got a very similar profile. New York up at the top is pretty level, but overall the trend is marginally down, and some of the other centres, you've got Toronto in there. I apologise to several members of the audience who come from Chicago. I haven't actually put Chicago on the map, but it would be in between the red line and the orange lines. It's a leading center. This was another question. When we do our questionnaire, we're able to ask a lot of other questions of financial professionals, and this was just more out of interest than anything else I put this in. These are important considerations when looking to invest in emerging markets. And you have, sorry about this, I keep pressing the wrong button when I want the pointer. There we go. The highest one that gets mentioned more regularly than anything else is macroeconomic stability, including inflation, interest rates. Then you've got the legal and regulatory environment, openness, competitiveness, barriers to trade, then levels of corruption, political stability, availability of skilled labour, market size, etc., etc. It's all in the report, but nonetheless quite an interesting flavour of what investors want when they're looking at emerging and developing economies. We map stability, which is how, well, very simply, it's how stable centres are and how volatile they are to move in terms of the smallish changes in either the instrumental factors or people's perceptions. Now, most of the offshore centres, I keep doing this, there we go, tend to be they're clustered in the middle there. But again, you probably won't be able to see that terribly clearly, but it is in our report. This is an interesting slide. This is questions from when asked directly about the area of competitiveness that people are worried about right now, and this does change every 6 months. At the moment, the business environment tops the list, and in particular, the things that get mentioned most is the rule of law and levels of corruption. That seems to be the couple most important factors that people are mentioning right now. 3 years ago, it was about people and the availability of labour and the flexibility of the labour markets. Now we look at people. It's coming back a bit. It's of increasing importance, and the availability of skilled labour in emerging markets is a great concern to a lot of people. Then you've got levels of taxation, levels of reputation, and that's becoming far more important. As, you can be a great financial centre, but if people don't know about it, then you're going to struggle a bit. And then infrastructure and market access are there, but they're the areas that people are concerned about right now. We list centres, again, just by looking at the instrumental factors in a particular group. We're able to look at centres in terms of their area of competitiveness. Most of the offshore centres tend to do pretty well in the business environment and actually in market access. We asked people which they think are going to be the most significant financial centres, and quite a number of these match what Simon was talking about. Look at Asia there, Singapore, Shanghai, Hong Kong, Seoul. Then you've got Toronto, and then you've got Sao Paulo, and you've just got the top 10 there, but the other Latin American countries or centres come in just outside the top 10, but nonetheless people are talking about the increased significance. No surprise there, I guess, but nonetheless of interest. Offshore centres, well, we've heard all about it from Simon, the sort of reputational damage, everybody commenting negatively or adversely about the offshore centres. In 2007, in 2008, pretty rocky ride that shows over the last 6 or 7 years. Most centres now, most of the offshore centres that we've studied, people are telling us they've recovered that lost ground. Most of them are growing reasonably steadily over in terms of their perceptions of them over the last few years, and I think that is, in measure, a lot of things that you guys have been doing in terms of, well, everything that Simon was talking about, in terms of tax information, transparency, fighting corruption, but also explaining to people what offshore centres actually do and why they're actually valuable to the whole financial system, if you like. So overall, I think that's actually quite an encouraging picture. We still have the Channel Islands right up there with some of the other centres, but also a lot of the Caribbean centres are showing that sort of picture, and their reputations have grown and have increased a little over the last year or so. That's a list of the offshore ratings. It's taken straight from the report, so I don't expect you to read that. But at the moment, we've got Jersey, Guernsey, then Monaco. Is Monaco offshore? I don't know. Then the Cayman Islands, Isle of Man, British Virgin Islands. Having said that, I've done it again. I don't believe this. Here we go. The scores there, 668 to 660. That's only 8 points on a scale of 1,000. That's only 6. That's another 5 or 6, 7. So there's actually very little to choose. So I wouldn't be too concerned about the actual rankings. Yes, they're an indication, but actually all of these sort of centres are very closely grouped together. They're all within a handful of points on such a large scale. But there is that group at the top which lead clearly from other centres. You've got Hamilton Bermuda, which is a very different case because it's very heavily focused on insurance and reinsurance rather than the other sort of offerings. And then you've got some of the other centres that are developing as offshore centres or have got things attached to them that are still not as positive news as some of the Caribbean centres. So you've got Malta, Mauritius. Bahamas, I'm slightly surprised is so down, but it is growing nonetheless. It's showing one of the largest increases, and I think that's actually over there, that increase over the last year is pretty dramatic. It's one of the largest increases, so I expect to see them shooting up pretty well. And then hardly surprisingly, right now, you've got in the last 6 months, you've got Cyprus down at the bottom of the offshore centres. I can't imagine why. What we're able to also measure is the different centres and where their assessments come from and how favourable the assessments and perceptions are of respondents around the world. So here, for example, you can see that although only a relatively small percentage come from Middle East, Latin America, generally North America the respondents there are very favourable or favourably inclined towards the Bahamas. The other offshore centres are actually less well inclined on Bahamas. European and Asian centres are marginally less positive than the mean. BVI, positive responses there, very good assessments, strong assessments from the other offshore centres. So the other offshore centres, people from the other offshore centres do rate the BVI very highly. We do, in all of these numbers, I should point out that we exclude what we call home assessments. So if you're based in the BVI and you rate BVI, we will actually take that assessment out because you see huge levels of what we would call home bias in some centres, not in all of them, but it's quite interesting to look at the levels of home bias between different centres, and some of the Chinese ones, for example, have very high levels of home bias. So we strip all of those out, so this is just looking at assessments that come from outside that jurisdiction. I apologise to people from the Cayman Islands for the title, which says Caymans, which is not correct. It should either, I believe, say Cayman or the Cayman Islands, but Nick, who's a Bulgarian, put this slide together, so I will let I'll let him off just this once, but I do apologise. You think it's funny that he's Bulgarian? You should try when he writes a report. I have to translate it back into English, basically. My boss thinks I translate it into Yeandlese, and he then has to translate it back into English, but we won't go there. Cayman Islands, again, positive from the offshore centres, less positive from European respondents and Asia-Pacific respondents. Cyprus, a very different pattern in some ways. Well, not so different, actually, but some of the offshore centres rate it fairly well. North America, it's actually a very small percentage of the respondents, but a lot of other centres don't rate it terribly highly. Gibraltar, much less favourable from Asia and from Europe, but really very favourable from 62% of respondents who assessed Gibraltar from other offshore centres, which surprised me slightly. Jersey, they get a good rating from the offshore centres, respondents from other offshore centres, less so from Asia Pacific and Europe. Guernsey, pretty similar picture. Isle of Man, again, not dissimilar at all. The other offshore centres are clearly backing those UK-based centres. That's Luxembourg, very negatively viewed by the offshore centres, interestingly. And are they offshore or not? Well, they're there for, I put them in this presentation for a reason, but more to show the contrast. They're not very well viewed by offshore centres or respondents from offshore centres. These can go on, and so we'll skip. I think Malta is probably about the last one. Offshore centres mildly positive, less positive again from respondents from Asia and respondents from mainland Europe. And no, I've got one more, Hamilton. Less well received by other offshore centres, but it is, as I say, very much a niche element, and pretty much similar apart from that. Mauritius, Europeans don't rate Mauritius very highly, but most of the other people, it's above average. We're also able to do what we call industry sector analysis, where we look at respondents just from a particular sector and rerun the index just with using their responses. It doesn't surprise me really that the global leaders like London, New York, Singapore, Hong Kong, Tokyo rate pretty well in those. If you want a picture of where the offshore centres sit, I've only got the top 10 listed there. They're very well viewed within investment management, generally asset management, wealth management, no great surprises there. Similarly, their banking is less good. Professional services, very highly. Respondents from the professional services rate the offshore centres extremely well, which is interesting to me. People who are regulators and are in government who also fill our survey in still have this negative perception about offshore centres. Certainly UK and US regulators who help us with the questionnaire, they rate the offshore centres well below the mean. But a lot of the leading offshore centres, you'll see Cayman very high in the investment management, just outside the top 10, but nonetheless very high in the listing of 77, and similarly Jersey and Guernsey. So they're all just outside the top, the leading ones are just outside the top 10 in investment management at least. We measure reputation. It's an interesting measurement, but what we try and do is we look at the score that a centre would get just based on the assessments, the time-weighted assessments, because we give, in the index itself, we give a higher value to more recent assessments and lower value to those given some time ago. So in order to make the numbers more comparable, we weight them by time. But we look at the average assessment, compare that with the GFCI rating, which is fairly heavily determined by those 96 external factors, and we come up with a measure, if you like, of the reputation, because reputation will affect people's perceptions of a place. And so if the assessments which are based on perceptions are much higher than the GFCI rating, which is influenced by the quantitative numbers, we say it has a positive rating. People are thinking more highly of that financial centre than the numbers alone would suggest they ought to. And you see that some Boston, Tokyo, Singapore, a lot of those sort of centres have very positive reputational advantage. Then down at the bottom of the list, the people with very negative reputational advantage, or a reputational disadvantage, if you like, the centres where people think less well of the centres themselves than the numbers alone would suggest. You've got Reykjavik right at the top of the list, followed by Tallinn, Athens, Budapest, Prague, St. Petersburg, etc. So that's the top and the bottom, but just to select some of the offshore centres' reputations, and I've included here some which aren't directly offshore or may be considered offshore. Again, we come back to that taxonomic argument. But you've got a reputational advantage for places like Hong Kong, Monaco, surprisingly Luxembourg. The Channel Islands are pretty, they're either very slightly positive or pretty neutral. Unfortunately, most of the offshore centres still have a negative reputation, or if you like, a reputational disadvantage, saying that most of the respondents rate the offshore centres less well than the numbers alone, the pure sort of hard numbers alone, would actually suggest. And I will come back to that in a moment. But now, it's not surprising to see Cyprus right down at the bottom, but even people like Cayman Islands, British Virgin Islands do have slightly negative perceptions. People don't think of them as well as perhaps they ought to. These generalities, you've got the next day and a half to go into specifics. It's not my job to go into specifics, but and I'm not an expert, so I shouldn't even be trying, but from the responses that we get and the assessments, we know that the offshore centres are strong in wealth management. We know that they're strongly perceived in professional services, as I mentioned a moment ago. They're weaker when viewed by regulators, and they are particularly seen as weak by all the respondents who are in the insurance sector, with the exception of Bermuda, as you'd imagine. And that's possibly just a lack of knowledge or a lack of certainty about the offshore centres. But we do ask people to only rate the centres with which they're familiar. So the people who generally from the insurance sector do reckon that they're sufficiently familiar with offshore centres to rate them, but they do rate them fairly negatively. Challenges, well, again, you'll get a lot more detail on this in the next day and a half. Simon alluded to quite a few of these, but they still carry on. Larger nations continuing to apply pressure, trying to prevent tax competition, if you will. The OECD, peer reviews, tax information exchange agreements, OECD members continuing to sort of put pressure on to try and limit the use of what they would describe as havens, which I'll try and avoid using because I think it's a slightly loaded word, but nonetheless they tend to use it. Publicity about tax planning schemes, then we know about FATF, and the rest of it isn't news to you at all. What I believe the offshore centres must do, and I'm coming towards the end of what I really want to say on this, you've seen the reputation, you've seen that people around the world think that you're slightly less good than you actually are on paper. You need to overall continue to increase transparency. That's improved massively over the last few years. You've got the OECD whitelisting, which Simon again referred to, continuing to demonstrate a commitment to meeting international standards. Again, there have been great improvements in that area, but it's something that I believe, and certainly my respondents believe, that there's a fair way to go. Continuing to demonstrate the skill levels and the specializations that you can apply, and demonstrate where offshore centre finance fits into the overall global picture of finance. Because most people in London or mainland Europe that I speak to all the time as part of my job, the first thing they mention when you talk about offshore centres is tax evasion. They still talk about it, or money laundering. And people haven't got the message yet. People who know about offshore centres know that they're far better than that. But most people involved in finance, investment banking, who aren't involved with the offshore centres still don't know. And most of the people in London still don't know. So PR about benefits and the functions that offshore centres give is critically important. if the offshore centres are continuing to thrive and to continue to grow in reputation and grow in stature, you guys have to fight back against all the politicians who are constantly railing against you. As I say at the bottom, you've got a really good story to tell. You've got a great story to tell. You've got to go out and tell it. You really have got to go out and tell it and make sure that the PR gets through to these people who don't understand offshore centres. GFCI 14 is out in September. Please do participate yourselves. You've all got knowledge and experience of other financial centres. Please participate. Be some of our respondents in the future. Where am I? 25:2. We've still got 10 minutes or so for questions if anybody has any. Thank you.
Yeah, I've got a question. One of the things I've noticed, covering the offshore world as a journalist, is that the competition between different jurisdictions is such that they seem unwilling to sort of get together to sort of promote the general concept of offshore finance. Do you see that changing at all? Do you see any willingness among different jurisdictions to come together for a greater good and a common cause?
I would love it to happen. I'm a great believer in the role that offshore centres play in world finance. I would love it to happen for promotional purposes, all the rest of it. Whether it will happen or not, I don't know. If it did, it would add a lot of benefit. It's quite interesting looking at different countries, and I'm going to annoy one or two of the Canadians now, because it amuses me looking at Canada. The centres there are so competitive with each other. The people from Toronto and the people from Montreal, the people from Vancouver are constantly trying to out-promote each other. Whereas actually there's a really good story that could come out of Canada as a whole. And I think there is huge benefit in not competing. We are in a similar game. I don't think it's a zero-sum game for the offshore centres, and the rise of one will mean the decline of another. I think that overall offshore centres can grow in reputation and in importance, but that'll only happen if people tell the story, tell the correct story of offshore centres, and by getting together you will only make that story stronger. Come on, there must be a few questions out there.
I have a question for, I guess, both speakers, Simon and Mark. Both of you touched on the role of tax treaty networks, like either DTA or information exchange, as a potential factor for selecting a domicile country offshore. I was wondering, aside from tax motives, could you also talk about other factors that might lead to choose a specific country for your offshore domicile, in particular, the BIT networks, bilateral investment treaty networks? I don't know, is that not important, or is it something that someone should be concerned about when they choose to set up either in Cayman or Bahamas?
Do you want? Oh, you're not wired up. Oh, well. I think the bilateral tax agreements are important. I think information transparency is also very important. There are a whole raft of other factors, but as I come back to the thing that you've got to do is most of these the centres that we're talking about are on the OECD white list. They're tackling corruption. They're actually, as we will hear in the next day and a half, a lot about the improvements that are being made and the challenges and investigations that are coming together. I think all these things are important, but I would come back to the overall factor. You've actually got to tell people. In some ways, it's all very well having tax transparency and lots of tax information agreements in place, but you've actually got to tell people. And a lot of people who are considering it still don't really. They've still got this black cloud hanging over the Caribbean, which in reality, of course, is not there.
just quickly, I think I'm mic'd up. Don't underestimate the importance of habit and practice, and I think that that's key. Clients will go to their advisors, and they'll say what they want to achieve, and their advisor will say, oh, well, that's how you do it. You do that through this method because that method has been tried and tested. So habit and practice, I think, DTAs and everything are building blocks to put in place those relationships, and many jurisdictions are competing to put those in place. But I think habit and practice, and there's a great deal when you look at my presentation in terms of the leading jurisdictions in certain areas. Certain of that it just boils down to practice and habit, and the stickiness of those sort of habits that have established over years.
Any more? I didn't say anything too controversial. Pick me up on anything if you think I did. No?
Okay, well,
Okay.
thank you. I don't think there is anyone, right? Anyone else? So thank you.